Hello and welcome to the Northern Myths Podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Luke DeWolf.
And I'm Dan Larrabee.
Today, we're excited to have our first guest on the show. It's a fellow podcaster who started right around the same time as us, and he's a good friend of the show, good friend of ours. His show is the History of Vikings Podcast, show with a lot of great interviews with many great people who talk about Vikings, mythology, a whole bunch of different things, plus a few other episodes where he digs into the history of Vikings himself. Highly recommend you check it out. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome onto the show Noah Tetzner of the History of Vikings. Welcome, Noah.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke and Dan. It's a real treat to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. We're pretty big fans of your podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise. Like I just said, huge fan of the show, so it's really an honor to be able to take part in the discussion.
Absolutely. And, I think we'd like to give our listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit better. Can you just tell us about yourself, a little bit about your background, your show?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Noah from the History of Vikings, and I started my podcast around 3 months ago. It's obviously the name kind of explains it very well, but it's about Vikings and Norse mythology, and every episode is a discussion with a featured sort of Viking, Norse myth-related expert guest. And we have discussions about all sorts of things, from the Viking farmsteads to Viking longships to their raids, their mythology, just really everything that you would want to know about Vikings we talk about in my show. And I've been a long-time fan of history, long-time fan of mythology, so I'm really excited to where I'm at the point where I get to share that passion with the world, and I'm very excited to talk with you guys today, as I absolutely love your series on the Kalevala, by the way. I mean, I love all your work, but that's exceptional. I've been a big fan of that recently, so very excited to be here today.
Well, thank you very much. We're pretty big fans of the Kalevala as well. I know I haven't looked at it before, so it's been sort of a wild ride reading it and seeing the the purposeful mythology within it. It's pretty awesome. Yeah,
absolutely. It's just really such an interesting text. A lot of archetypes, like you cover in your episodes, but really such a unique and rich poetry.
Oh yeah, and it's a different style than the Norse poetry, but it's just so, I mean, it's lyrical. It's meant to be sung. The picture that Dan found, I think he posted to our Instagram of two brothers. I guess they were sitting face to face and holding hands, and they would sing. I think the general way to do it would be one person would sing a line, and then the next person would sing the next line or repeat the line, something like that. And it was just a whole big experience. And I mean, yeah, I definitely personally get that when I'm reading it. It's just so lyrical, and it's so flowing, right? It's a different style, but just so interesting, so powerful. Our next episode is coming right up. We're recording in a couple of days, that one, so excited for that one. So
yeah, definitely. It's I would love to see. I don't know if they still do that traditional way of singing it, but it's something that I would love to witness in person and kind of feel it, with people who actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, that'd be something else.
Oh, for sure. So, hey, on your show, you've talked to so many different interesting people, covering, well, a huge range of topics, actually. I mean, so wide-ranging, like you've already mentioned. What got you into kind of the Vikings in particular?
Well, I've always loved history, and I've always loved the medieval period. But I suppose my interest and fascination in the Viking Age is fairly a new interest. I discovered the Vikings when I discovered Norse mythology and the primary sources, digging into the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, as well as some of the sagas, the Saga of the Volsungs especially. And I just became so enamored by these myths because, and I suppose it's Norse mythology that really sparked my passion for mythology. Just, wow, just the great stories, but I hate using the word story because they're just so much deeper than stories. The amount of impact and influence that these myths had, they were able to shape people's character and shape people's lives is so incredible. But anyways, it was Norse myth that got me excited about Vikings because after all, the Vikings were the ones worshiping these gods. And I just immediately fell in love with that era of history, and I thought, well, I got to start a podcast on this, and thus the History of Vikings was born, and been able to talk to a lot of great people, like you mentioned, your good selves tonight, and many other people in the future. So it's just a real treat of mine that I get to do this. It's just a great pleasure.
It's such a good point on how doing this sort of thing is just it always feels to me when we record these episodes and when we get any feedback at all, it's just mind-blowing and amazing that someone could be listening to this or watching this in our case on our YouTube. But just to get any little bit of feedback and to just get to do this at all, it feels like such a great experience. Yeah, I think you got that exactly right. How it's just it's so awesome to get to do this.
So, did you recently discover Norse mythology, or did you see it like when you were a kid and hear about it, and then just sort of read about it and I guess see it here and there as you're growing up, or so? What's the story on that?
Yeah, so when I was a kid growing up, I kind of heard bits and pieces like all of us basically from the Marvel movies and then the Marvel comics and everything like that, but it really didn't mean much to me. And I kind of failed to realize that these characters in these Marvel movies were so much more than the way that they were portrayed in these movies. It was just kind of part of another fantasy universe in my mind. And strangely enough, I actually, I'm a big history gamer, humongous gamer, and I was playing a game called Age of Mythology, and a lot of the characters were Norse. So strangely enough, I was thinking about that, and since I was very passionate about the game, it made me want to dig deeper. And so, I discovered Dr. Jackson Crawford's Norse Mythology and Old Norse channel, and just was, binge watching all of his videos. Just incredible. It really brought the myths to life for me, and ever since I've just been so ingrained, and they've been such a part of my life.
That's awesome. It's always neat to see how people get into the things that they love, but also like Norse mythology, because I think, especially with the Marvel movies, it would be very easy just to stop with the comics and the movies rather than actually go and search out the source material for the characters. And then, and then once you see that, it's kind of like, wow, there's a whole other world and whole other story that they've taken these characters from it, and really, I would say, kind of divorced them from it. Like they've really, the Thor in the Marvel movies, he's recognizable as the Thor from the myths, but there's a lot of differences that maybe make him more palatable to modern audiences. I don't know.
Yeah. And
yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I think there's a lot of watering down of characters as well. A lot of minimalization going on, just in terms of a lot of the characters in Norse myth, basically all of the characters aren't just black and white. They really have multiple personalities, but just their personalities are also vastly different, and the way that they interact with each other makes for just such great tales. And I think that's why Norse myth is as awesome as it is because it has such great characters. But in the Marvel movies, yeah, Odin is just, this gentle gray-haired old man, and Thor is just kind of this burly hothead guy, and, Heimdall is just kind of the guy who watches over the bridge and stuff. It doesn't really there's no significance to it. But yeah, I just think very different from how the myths actually were.
Yeah, the complexity of the characters alone is, they're quite one-dimensional in the Marvel universe. I won't say exclusively, and to be clear, I've never read any Thor comics or anything like that, and I think the only Thor movie I've watched is the original Thor, but still, very one-dimensional, but still very much tied to the idea of the hero, right? Which is kind of the universal story. And I mean, without those elements, the Marvel movies would not be nearly as successful as they are, right? They certainly follow the hero's journey perspective and a lot of archetypal themes, honestly. But the great part, as you mentioned, about these stories, to me, has been seeing all this complexity. I mean, in our last couple of episodes, we've seen some examples of quite questionable behavior from major gods and from Odin as well. And I mean, that's just it means that they're not clearly hero villain. If anything, I found it's a lot of, we're following this whole story from the perspective of this one tribe, the gods, the Aesir. This is like sort of one perspective, and they have their enemies, and they make mistakes, and they do bad things sometimes. But you know what? Who doesn't do that? So I think they're even a much better example because they're so relatable and so relatable to something that could actually be real, right? So that's some really really great parts about the myths that I like in particular.
Definitely, and that's not. I don't want anyone listening or watching to think that we're knocking the Marvel movies. Like I enjoy them. They're just fairly different from the myths. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. Just want to make sure that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Maybe a little bit, if you don't mind, a little bit about how you got into podcasting in general, because I mean, for us, it was something we talked about for a long time, but I don't even remember what the exact reason we landed on as far as why we started this whole thing. But is there a reason you gravitated towards podcasting?
Yeah, my dad was always just a big podcast listener, and he was, loved his podcasts. Always, when I would, go on drives with him and my family, he'd always play a podcast, and we'd always talk about some of the podcasts that we listened to together and stuff. And we just listened to all sorts of, genres, business, and, I listened to history and whatever. And I thought, podcasting is really this special sort of media. It's not like YouTube where, it's basically at this point saturated and very difficult to build up an audience. Podcasting is very different in that it's a fairly new sort of media, and it's just very different. I know that the podcasts that my dad and I listen to, we've reached out to the hosts, exchanged emails. They've, talked about us on their shows before. This really sort of special intimacy. And you just, become great friends with the hosts that you admire and the hosts that you listen to. So I thought, why don't I start a history podcast about Vikings? I knew that I wanted to have it be an interview format simply because 99% of all history podcasts out there are just script written, which I think that many of them do that very well. But I think, unfortunately, because of the whole script read thing, there's no room for discussion, and thus it makes kind of a very droning, boring show. But I digress, and I decided to start the History of Vikings, and it was just kind of, I don't really know how it happened. It was out of a natural love for podcasts, I suppose.
That's awesome. And I suppose with the scripted history podcast, like, unless you're Dan Carlin doing hardcore history, like, if you can't match up to that, then really, what's the point?
Exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah.
No, that was the first podcast that I really listened to, and I mean, I really enjoyed his long format, and I mean, I wasn't familiar with podcasts in general when I was getting going, but I'd always heard Hardcore History recommended, and then when it kind of got into his really long series, that's what I enjoyed most, was listening to his like 5-6 part episode series. But then I think it was the one about the Roman Republic that just really got its hooks into me, where he just went into so much detail, and he was already like 4 or 5 episodes in, something like that, and then his final episode of that series was 5 hours. Yeah. And I don't know, I loved that so much, and there was just something about how you could go for such a long time, and I mean I'm sure that was like not all one take. I mean maybe it was, but like a single day of recording or something like that. But no, that's is just impressive, and I mean certainly it's something to strive for as a benchmark, right? Definitely one of the more influential podcasts for me. So
yeah, absolutely, and I think that show's really one of a kind. Like a lot of definitely I get a lot of inspiration from Hardcore History and Carlin's work, but I think a lot of podcasters just simply try to copy what he's doing as opposed to get inspired from it. So that's where a lot of folks fall short, because it's just kind of, mimicking his work. But I get inspiration from his work, and I'm certainly a huge fan. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm also a big fan, and I would say I've definitely been inspired to do podcasting from Hardcore History. For me, it was the blueprint for Armageddon, his like 24-hour magnum opus on World War I.
Oh,
like that one is incredible. And there's something about podcasting, and it's kind of a funny medium because it's so old-fashioned. It's basically radio. And yet it's somehow making a comeback just with new technology, but that there does seem to be a magic with radio that other mediums don't capture, but I just think it's kind of funny.
Yeah, no, it's definitely sort of strange in a way if you think about it like that, but it's so true. Just people in the 30s and 40s, families gathered around their radio. That's kind of like my dad and I, and my mom and my sister, but my dad and I listen to podcasts as we, drive places and stuff. We're all sort of huddled around the car radio in that way. So,
what are some other podcasts of yours that you like that are influential on you?
Oh, I would say that, when I was starting out my podcast, the podcasts that had the most influence on me at that point were definitely Hardcore History. Another one's History on Fire with Daniele Bolelli, and I actually had him on my show, so that'll be coming out this Monday, so that'll be sweet. But and then I would say that the podcasts that are the most influential, they're actually people that I've met in my journey with podcasting. So a great podcast is Dangerous History, and it's by Professor CJ. That's a really cool one. Really great look at different historical events from sort of an unconventional format. Gosh, what else? There's so many great shows out there. Celtic Myths is a new one that I've been listening to. That's really cool. You guys, of course, is really cool. I'm probably missing like, 20 other ones that I listen to all the time, but there's just so many great stuff out there. But I would say those that I mentioned were kind of the key ones that have influenced me.
That's awesome. I think I remember seeing Celtic Myths kind of on Twitter a little bit when that was kind of first getting started, or kind of a few episodes in or something. Yeah, that's another one. I think the Celtic side of things is another branch of mythology that we would enjoy covering one day. Yes. But I mean, that'll be a situation where we both know very little about it. So I mean, that's definitely gonna be down the road. But no, that's another great podcast, fantastic. And Daniele Bolelli is another really really cool figure. That's awesome that you've got him on your show.
Yeah, no, that was a great interview. It was very last minute. I was like, dude, do you want to come on my show? Blah, blah, blah. And he's like, sure, how about we do it right now? And I was like, okay. And we just kind of talked about history, podcasting in general. And that was really inspiring having that conversation with him because, we kind of talked about, and I asked him questions about kind of how do you captivate an audience as a history podcaster? How can you make history come to life for people? Because, history is very much, in my personal opinion, something that's alive today. But I feel like when people read droning scripts, they fail to present it that way. But it was just a great time, and I'm excited. I hope people get a lot out of it and enjoy it. Especially I hope other podcasters listen to it because I think we could all learn a great deal from it.
Definitely know I'll be tuning in.
Yeah. Awesome.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I guess we'll move on a little bit here. This is something that I think we want to ask to all our guests in general, just because it's such a related question for us, but it's also so interesting to kind of hear what these answers are. So, what is your favorite story or character or whatever from Norse mythology?
Oh, my favorite story. Oh, there's just so many. Man. Gosh, I mean, I would say, honestly, I've always loved the myth of creation. As weird as that might sound, I don't know. I just really like how the world came into existence. I think that's fascinating. Just with the great world tree and the 9 worlds and kind of where everyone fits and into this universe and the mythic landscape, we're kind of setting the stage for all the rest of the myths. I just love that, the creation account in Norse myth. My favorite character, I would say, is somebody who I actually know very little about, and that is the seafaring god Njord. Some might say a god of fertility as well, and merchants and that. But I don't know why he's my favorite god. I've just always kind of had this personal connection with him because I've always loved the water, and I don't know. It's weird because he seems like a very significant person in the myths. I mean, he is the head of the Vanir family of gods. Is he the father of Frey? I want to say, right? The father of Frey?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. Yeah, so very significant in the myths, but yet it seems like there's only a few myths where he's mentioned. I mean, the most famous being his complicated marriage to Skadi. Her living in her beloved mountains and him living by the sea, and they couldn't really agree upon a place to live. But I'm curious as to what you guys know about Njord, because, like I said, he seems like a really significant guy, but yet he comes up so little in the myths, or does he? So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, Njord. Another one of my favorites as well, and also kind of similarly mysterious for similar reasons. I mean, he's so highly regarded. He's got a few places named after him, which is one of the ways that we can tell that a god was kind of actively worshipped. If they had a place named after them, I think there's some in Sweden, some in Denmark. You can tell that they were kind of actively worshipped there. But the most interesting part about Njord, to me, is actually not necessarily Njord himself, but about essentially what you would call his sister goddess, Nerthus, who's only really mentioned in Tacitus. So he's a Roman historian who went... I believe actually the story about this is that he didn't go himself, but it was accounts of other people who traveled up to the region, and he compiled them. And he also has other histories, Roman histories, and so he's like a big figure. But he wrote Germania, and that book, first of all, is a fantastic source, a look at the really early Germanic peoples, and this would be kind of continental Germanic, what nowadays would be like, the Germany, and it would have been kind of into the France area as well. I think at the time there was not nearly as much a distinction between the Celtic peoples and the Germanic peoples, mostly because I figure they couldn't really tell the language groups apart too well, or maybe they kind of mixed and blended quite a bit, especially in the border regions. But anyway, so Nerthus was the big fertility goddess of these people, and I mean, the biggest reason that we can tell that Njord and Nerthus are related, it's really just linguistics. It's the names are just so similar. They construct back to the same root word in Proto-Germanic, which is the reconstruction based on all the modern Germanic languages that we have of what probably, like a close approximation of what was probably spoken back about 2,000 years ago, maybe a little older than that. And so they construct to the same root, with just Nerthus being the feminine and Njord being kind of the Norse version of the masculine. And it's just so interesting to have that connection, because Nerthus is like a really typical earth goddess. She is like, well, and this, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but like this whole concept is like central to so many religions. The idea of fertility in general, the fertility of the earth, the fertility of the cycle of vegetation. It's so fundamental, and it's what we would have discovered when agriculture was first coming about, and just the idea that woman, the female, they understand the mystery of creation, and so they are the ones who symbolically would understand what's happening with the earth, creating life that grows the plants, right? And so Nerthus was one of these goddesses, and Nerthus was revered. She was taken around on a procession throughout the lands, and people would get to see her cart thing and her statue, and they would worship it. But then she would get taken back to her home island, sort of thing, and then there would be these slaves who would wash the cart and wash her statue, if I'm getting this correctly, and then the slaves would be drowned because no one is allowed to touch her and live, which is just brutal.
Wow.
Huh?
Yeah. Oh, that's crazy. Yeah. Definitely. With all of the sort of like, in other mythologies, you have sort of this like female god figure, almost like birthing the cosmos into existence. And it's interesting you mentioned Tacitus, because that's one question I get constantly, just numerous times. It's like, people are like, what's the difference between Norse mythology and Germanic mythology? And is Norse mythology sort of a more narrow like sect of Germanic mythology? And while I've attempted to answer that to the best of my ability, that's another thing I'd actually like to discuss with you guys here, because you guys have covered more mythologies than I am. I'm just kind of the Norse mythology person, and I've recently been venturing off into the Kalevala and Celtic myth. But what do you guys think about that?
You can go first, Luke.
Okay, on the spot here. So Germanic mythology to me is sort of a broad, encompassing way of seeing the religions that this one language group of people would have practiced. And I divide it up into language groups because that really is, it seems to be the easiest way to divide the cultures that have been produced in the world. I mean, we have now Celtic mythology, right? And those language groups have sort of mostly died out, but certainly they're, with the exception of like Irish and Welsh, they're still kind of going strong over there, but but then you have Slavic, which is kind of its own distinct thing. It's very specific. You have Baltic, which is definitely its own flavor to a lot of these things. Then Greek, then Roman, and these are all different language groups, and that's a really good way of splitting it. But then the Germanic languages and the Germanic language groups. So that's in the modern day, that's German, Dutch, that's English. English is a Germanic language, and then that's all the Scandinavian languages. I'm for sure missing a few specific examples, but those are the main ones, right? And those are really just branches. These days, we have essentially continental Germanic, which is German, Dutch, and all that. And then you got English, and then you've got the Scandinavian languages, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic. But they are sort of one branch, the North branch. And that's where the Norse comes from. Old Norse is really the descendant, the language that all of these other modern languages descended into. Icelandic being kind of the closest. Faroese is also not too far away from kind of original Old Norse. And then Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, they all kind of did their own thing for a little while and became a little more simplified. But anyway, the Germanic side of it, I also bring in Anglo-Saxon beliefs where we can draw from that. Beowulf is a good example of, say, that's really more of a saga within Anglo-Saxon, but they have their own sources, and there's a lot of good sources for Anglo-Saxon mythology and religion, and then there would be continental Germanic, which is essentially, well, Tacitus is one of our best sources for that, just because it's so old, and Christianity came through a lot earlier in continental, what's now like kind of Germany and all that. Like Charlemagne had a big influence in all that, and so I mean that's in the late 700s, early 800s, something like that, and it was later for Scandinavia and sort of things, and they're the ones who wrote it down, and that would be why the Norse is the most prominent. But I group the three of them. Anglo-Saxon, continental, Germanic, and Norse kind of all together when I'm comparing and contrasting, because it can give such a good picture of what was probably in common and different views of different beliefs.
The other thing I'd like to add in the Germania, and I'm trying to remember the names, but there's sort of a head god named Twisto, who was, the father of the tribes, and he had a son, Manus, and then Manus had 3 sons, and I guess these 3 sons, they made 3 different tribes, and the tribes sort of went into these areas that you'd see like the Norse and the Anglo-Saxon and sort of like more continental inland things, and you can actually kind of trace, I guess, through the account in Germania, just how like the different languages would have developed, and so I would say that Norse is kind of under the umbrella of the Germanic stories. It's, I guess, a long-winded way of saying that. Yeah, that the Norse is sort of the long-winded, like the northern seafaring people under the Germanic umbrella.
Right, because Tacitus, that's the Roman, I don't know what you'd call him, a historian probably would be an appropriate term. That's his observations of like sort of what is now mainland Germany, right? The people living there, what the Romans would have considered the barbarians, the various tribes there.
Exactly, and that is where the Germanic peoples would have eventually kind of come from. And the Anglo-Saxon peoples, they essentially came from what is now Denmark for the most part. The tribes around there were all in the peninsula of Denmark, if I'm getting that right. Also, some Frisians were kind of in there. That's like northern Holland, the northern Netherlands, Holland being one province of the Netherlands and Frisia being another province of the Netherlands, just to be specific. And then they would have also gone further north into Scandinavia, especially as the Ice Age retreated. They would have been more able to, and this would have been a lot longer ago, but still, it tracks why he was able to track this down, and they would have had an origin myth that encompasses different tribes. I've been reading a little bit about Hungarian mythology, and they have a similar origin story. I'm not going to get the names right, but one is it's something like Hun. The one hero, this is definitely a hero, is like named as a Hun, and another is named Magyar, which is like the name for their people, and the one went off into one direction and became the Huns, and the other went into what eventually became Hungary, because they conquered the Carpathian Basin, which is now Hungary. They conquered that. They were a people before that, and so their origin story ties them to the Hunnic peoples, and I mean they're quite divergent, they're quite different, but there's some evidence that there's a genetic link there, and they've got that similar story in their mythology, which I just thought was cool, and it's mirrored in Germania.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah, but it's funny you mentioned Hungary, because at what point in that sort of like Slavic provinces, the Croatia, Hungary, does it start getting into what we might call, Slavic mythology as opposed to Germanic?
So that one I don't know a whole lot about as far as the history goes, but I can say that Hungarian, the only related languages to it these days are Finnish and Estonian. So those are actually going to be more related to each other in sort of a mythological sense, and they are also connected to what's today known as Tengri, which is a religion of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. And there is some kind of attempt to revive this. I don't think they wrote, well, they might have. I don't want to say anything that I don't know too much about, but they're all about kind of the idea of the eagle, something like that. And I do know that the South Slavs and all that kind of migrated later at a different time as well. So it's a really interesting mixture. But Hungarian is kind of this island as far as its own mythologies and its own languages go, because it's not surrounded by anything else. And I believe there's a theory that like the Finnic, the Finno-Ugric languages were much more widespread throughout what's now mostly northwestern Russia, and then they spread out, and eventually Slavic took over, but it was originally much more widespread. Uralic being the language family that Finnish and Hungarian belong to.
Wow. Yeah, you really know your stuff, Luke. That's very impressive. And I ask that because, again, I've been talking about the Kalevala on Twitter lately, but I've been seeing some things that Slavic myth is very closely related to Finnish myth, so I just wanted to ask that question for that reason.
Yeah, they've got their similarities, but I definitely don't know enough about Slavic myth and the entire history about that. That's really just the little bit of background knowledge kicking around in my head, those sort of useless facts there, right? But one day, hopefully, with the Slavic, we'll get there.
Definitely, because I think they've got that god Chernobog. Yeah, I like him. So yeah, we'll definitely have to check him out sometime.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I think we originally got onto this because of Njord, and we only got so far as Nerthus. And so maybe just to circle back to that a little bit, like the connection between Njord and Nerthus is a little ambiguous because it's unclear. Well, we basically don't know whether Nerthus became Njord. Another theory that I like a lot is that they were a paired brother and sister, and that Njord and Nerthus were the parents of Freyr and Freya. Incest is different in mythology, something like that, more acceptable apparently. But
if I may just jump in there, is Nerthus mentioned in Norse myth?
No, Njord is the only example in Norse, which is why it becomes kind of nebulous. We've got basically 1,000-year gap between the mentions of Nerthus and the mentions of Njord, and their roles changed a little bit too, right? Njord is actually mentioned in some sagas, I believe, as being more related to fertility than we maybe give him credit for, and it's interesting, like kind of his role in being a seafarer. What I like about Njord, what my personal theory on Njord is that he is sort of the example of, or maybe even the god that became the lord over the seas because the Vikings went off and explored the sea. And maybe that's kind of how the transition happened, was that the sea suddenly became so important, and Njord was the head of this one kind of group of gods, right, the Vanir, and then he just becomes so important that they begin to associate him more with the sea. That's some speculation, but that's I think one way to explain it anyway, how he would have gone from sort of a female figure associated with the earth in Nerthus to sort of the seafaring god. But I do like the idea of them being kind of a pair, and Nerthus sort of eventually fading into the background, superseded by other goddesses, which is certainly possible as well, or they were always the same god and it was hermaphroditic, something like that. That's another mythological theme that exists, is that sort of a god that's at once male and female, but we can't really know, right?
I'm just thinking of Njord and like fertility, and well, Frey is his son is prosperity is another big one that sort of big value that they're supposed to bring for the people. And if the Norse were going into the water and fishing or whatever, I'm sure the fish was plentiful because there just wasn't enough people to overfish, right? So yeah, there'd definitely be a potential for like real riches and prosperity to be had from going off into the deep dark ocean. And who knows what's going to happen. It's it's very chaotic as well, so it does have that idea of sort of riding the chaos to bring the treasure home.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The sea was this unknown void in a way. I mean, that's why people never really discovered the Americas until they did, which, of course, the Vikings, arguably the first Europeans to do so. So, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's my personal thoughts on Njord. The connection to Nerthus has always been something that's fascinated me for years and years here. And so, I mean, I like that you brought Njord up, and I essentially can't mention Njord without mentioning Nerthus because it's just such an interesting connection, and it takes us back so far, right? Like, that's like 2,000 years, it's cool. It's like, it's deeper than we can go really than almost any other source we have on Norse or Germanic mythology, which I really like. So, hey, you also mentioned the creation story a little bit, and I mean, first of all, just maybe to encourage our listeners to tune into our appearance on your show, where we did talk about the creation story a little bit, but no, is there any particular reason why you liked the creation stories?
I suppose the creation myth was kind of the first place. It was kind of my introduction to the Norse mythology generally. It was where I started. It was the first myth that I really discovered. And I don't know, maybe it's a bit of nostalgia, but the first episode of my podcast was about the creation. And I don't know, it's so fascinating. Just the concept of the universe. Like, I love Yggdrasil. I just love the concept of the universe being in this great ash tree, and the roots and branches are, tangled up amongst the 9 realms, and Odin rides his horse, his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, across its branches. I just think that's so cool. I don't know. I love Yggdrasil. I just think it's a really interesting set for all of the characters in Norse myth to kind of operate on. I just, if that makes sense. It's not really a deep answer, but I don't know. I just like it in that way.
Yeah, there's definitely something about it. Like, and it's so different from what in the West we get in general, like Adam and Eve. That's sort of the go-to creation myth. Like, whether you're religious or not, that's sort of that's the culture, right? And then if you look at like Norse mythology, depending on the version, you either have like this hermaphroditic giant of and they don't say chaos, but he is like, he's not like good, he's not bad, he's just kind of he's kind of scary. And then you have these 3 brothers who kill him and then make the world out of him. And if you go to like a different story, you've got this cow licking ice to get like the giant and stuff like that. So it's just kind of weirdness all around. And if you haven't been exposed to it before or even like thought about it, I remember reading it just being like, what am I reading? This is bizarre.
Yeah. And at first, when I discovered the creation myth, I was like, this is so random. Like, what's this giant tree? And then there's this cow. But if you look at it like very in depth and you even think about it for a moment, even before digging deeper, everything in that myth has a place in the Viking worldview. The symbolism of cows, the tree. It makes sense that the world is envisioned in this tree because forests were, encompass, still do, but especially back then, enormous portions of Scandinavia.
Oh, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Everything in the story is they're there on purpose. These stories have been told for thousands of years over. Actually, I don't know how many generations that would be, but like probably hundreds.
Yeah, I was actually just reading something about how it's probably in the realm of 400 generations since the discovery of agriculture.
Wow.
But
yeah, so what you have is these stories get told and remembered and really distilled into the important parts because that's what people are going to remember. And then so you know, this cow shows up and it's like, okay, well, 400 generations down the line, it's kind of bizarre, but at the time, there would have been real knowledge attached to it. And I know for us, that's one of the points of our podcast is to rediscover that assumed knowledge so that we can get the value out of these stories other than just reading it, kind of chuckling at, you know, what, look at what these old people believed, you know, like that's not helping anyone, but
right,
you know, they weren't dumb. They did have an understanding of the world around them.
Yeah.
And I was just reading Mircea Eliade's History of Religious Ideas. It's one of my favorite books. I'm not even done, but it's one of my favorite books. Some of his others are also fantastic. The Sacred and the Profane is another really, really relevant book to a lot of the things we talk about. But in his book, History of Religious Ideas, it's really like this big tome of, and in chronological order for the most part, of religious traditions. And he was essentially a comparative religion. So that was sort of his thing. He had more of a complex title, and he did lots of things. But the Romanian guy. But what I was reading was the idea of world trees being essentially another artifact, if you will, of the discovery of agriculture, because it was something like the idea of the entire world being assimilated to a tree as a representation of the constant cycle of life and death and rebirth, and how, you know, like trees would get cut down and regrown, and it would be used for so many different things, so many different purposes. It's something that is just so powerful, and we have world trees in other traditions. I think we were talking with one of our first YouTube comments was someone mentioning how in Hinduism they have a world tree, and
oh wow.
Yeah, I don't think it's exactly the same. I haven't looked too far into that, but either way, it's an example, right? And I mean, just having that concept is just really cool, and the idea that it would be even across civilizations like that. I mean, those sorts of things point to there being something to it, something to the symbolism, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. The creation story. Really, really great story. I wish there was more on it, to be honest. And I mean, when we were talking about this on your show, you know, Dan got Ragnarok, and I mean, there's a lot on Ragnarok that you can go with there. But on creation, it's so nebulous. I definitely think there's a lot missing. There's a lot we have to it where we can understand it and interpret it, but I'm sure, you know, it would be just amazing to go back and have a conversation with someone who can explain the intricacies of their creation story and what it all specifically means. I would love that. But, you know, our little attempts at making sense of it, hopefully, are somewhat close to what they would have originally believed, you know?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be disheartening if, I don't know, there's like we found like a Norse mummy and we're able to bring him back to life, and he learns all this stuff and sees our podcast and just like, you guys are idiots, and like, wow, that we're sorry. Yeah.
No, I could totally see that happening.
So you've had quite a few, I'd say, like actual experts on your show, from like Carolyn Larrington to you've had Dr. Jackman Crawford on, and I'm trying to think of his name, Anders Winroth, yes, who wrote that. He wrote that great book on the Age of Vikings.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I read that a while ago, and when you talked about farmsteading and stuff, I remembered reading that chapter, and it sort of brought it back. But as you've talked to these, legitimate bona fide experts, have they told you anything that really blew your mind, where you just sort of had no idea that's how it worked, and then they sort of told you and you're like, oh my goodness, that's mind blowing?
All the time. I don't even know where to begin. That happens all the time. I think it's interesting because with all the technology we have nowadays, other than maybe a few lectures that were recorded on somebody's phone on YouTube, there's really not much content other than, written articles that these people, these great scholars in the Viking Age and Norse mythology really can showcase. So it's just been an absolute treat having them on and being able to discuss. But something that has really blown my mind. I just think, like with Caroline Larrington, just how she really, in her marvelous book called, I think it's Norse Myth, A Guide to the Gods and Heroes that she wrote about Norse mythology, just how she really looks at mythology very, not in a negative way, but just very generally, how just she really analyzes Christian mythology, just how the world was breathed into existence. I think the verse in the Bible is John 1:1. The Logos, the Word was, breathed into existence. And then just how you look at Norse myth, which is so vastly different, and you look at other mythologies where a female character births the world into being and everything. It's just like, that was really mind-blowing, just that basic concept, because that's what inspired me to discover the creation myths of other mythologies. Talking with Anders Winroth about the cleanliness of the Vikings, that was really interesting, how in the Scandinavian language, like Saturday means, bathing day, and how, obviously we found numerous combs in the Vikings, Ibn Fadlan, the sort of Arabic, I don't know what you'd call him, diplomat who observed the Vikings. They would pass around this wash bowl and they'd all sneeze and spit into it, and then they'd bathe out of it. Just the bathing of the Vikings, and how just the massive misconceptions we have about them, which of course I know, but hearing the different ones from an expert was really enlightening. Just so much all the time. I'm continually fascinated, and my brain has really been quite stimulated ever since I've started this podcast, because there's just so much to think about.
I get that feeling for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
No, you're thinking about combs. Like there were combs. I was just recently in Norway at the Viking ship museum, and that is like just the coolest museum. But they had combs in the burial finds there. All the ships they had there were buried, and it was like someone's funeral, essentially.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was like where they were laid to rest, sort of thing. And so, they had all the goods that they would have for, the rest of their life, sort of thing, and, in the afterlife and all that. And there was even like this chamber built on one of the ships that was still mostly intact, I believe. And it was like special. That's where the body went and everything like that. And there were these combs there. I actually forget if it was the combs were with the particular burial finds that were at the museum, or whether they were on loan from another find or something like that. But anyway, it was just really cool to see stuff like that as being, just these everyday items that maybe we don't think that these savage Vikings would have. But yeah, they did, and they had an emphasis on cleanliness and grooming. So that's pretty cool, right? Just to have that understanding,
Yeah, absolutely.
It really is and if you compare it with sort of the cleanliness standards in other parts of the world at the same time, and even later on, it's crazy how clean they were compared to, a lot of other parts of Europe, where they believe that if you washed the sort of oily film that you get on your skin after you don't bathe for a long time, that was supposed to protect you against evil spirits and stuff like that. Well, wow. Yeah, and so washing, you did it twice a year, whether you needed to or not, because you didn't want the evil spirits to come get you. And I think this was actually after the Vikings, sort of after the heyday of the Vikings, after the conversion happened. But yeah, it's just nuts to think that these, bloodthirsty, vicious, snarling Vikings, actually really cared if they smelled or how straight their hair was or things like that. So, yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, it's crazy.
No, you've had some fantastic conversations with people. That's really awesome, actually. I mean, certainly our show. I think we always had the idea that we would start to do interviews one day, but you've just taken it to a whole nother level with getting such great people on. Are there any others that you particularly enjoyed from your own show that you want to mention?
Yeah, I mean, my interview with Caroline Larrington was great, and I'll be having her on again. I'll be speaking to her in a few days, actually, about Ragnarok, so that'll be cool. And like I said, Anders Winroth was really special. Anders Winroth's wife, actually, Johanna Katrin, and I don't know how to pronounce the Icelandic last name. It's like Friggsdeuter or something like that. Great lady, just very passionate and just delightful. Talked about women during the Viking Age, and she's actually working on a book. It's supposed to come out next year, if I'm correct, about it's going to be called Valkyrie. It's about women during the Viking Age. So really special to have that conversation with her. Just because, like, you know, it's this whole sort of like shield maiden controversy, people getting really excited about it. She was really able to make an educated like analysis of the existence we have for shield maidens in a very considerate way of all viewpoints, which I really appreciated, and really just matching it up with archaeological evidence, which is always very crucial, you know.
Yeah.
So.
That actually sounds cool. I'm going to definitely pick up that book when it comes out.
100%.
Pre-order it if they have it.
Yeah.
Great. No, again, like, just really enjoyed all the interviews you've had with people. It's been an honor to be on your show as well. But no, I mean, like, it's really, well, first of all, it's actually really cool that these folks will come talk to guys like us just doing a podcast, right? I mean, that's just beyond. I mean, we've already talked about multiple times about just, you know, mind-blowing moments or whatever of doing a podcast.
Yeah.
And just that in general, it's so cool. It's one of the things that makes this so fulfilling to me, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Absolutely.
So something else you mentioned, and this is, I don't know if this is, well, something you mentioned when you talked about Njord a little bit. You mentioned you had sort of a personal connection to him, or you felt something like that. Is that actually like kind of something that you believe in? Like, you have connection to certain gods, goddesses? Is that something that you bring into your life at all?
I would say that I don't know if I necessarily believe it on a spiritual level, but I would say that I can still gain a lot of inspiration from the Norse myths. And, I mean, theoretically, anyone could find themselves relating to a character in literature. But I feel like mythology is so much deeper. I think the stories are just had such an, we've talked about, such an influence on people's lives as opposed to, you know, some other sort of like, medieval text, Canterbury Tales, Song of Roland, something like that. I mean, people believed in these gods and they had such influence on their worldview and daily life. But as far as Njord's concerned, I don't know. I just, I guess he's, there's a lot of mystery surrounding him, like we talked about, but yet he has such significance. And, he clearly seems, I don't know, my sort of gut reaction when talking about Njord is he's a very wise person, obviously himself being the head of the Vanir, but yet he's not the head honcho by any means, because the Vanir family of gods is sort of, some might even say, inferior to that of the Aesir family, simply because, you know, there's more giants involved in the marriages and everything else like that, some would say. But yeah, if that makes sense, I would just say I really get inspired from his character in Norse myth. That's
interesting. Now, I'm not saying this is the case for you, but I know for me, whenever I'm, I guess, identifying with a character from a story or a myth, it often means there's sort of an archetypal lesson there that I'm trying to figure out almost unconsciously, because, I don't know why I'm reading about werewolves or whatever, but, if I go on a werewolf kick, or, even like Bigfoot, whatever, but there's usually some reason. Well, I know, I think I heard Dr. Peterson talk about that in one of his lectures, how if you ever like connect with a story and you kind of keep going back to it, actually he was talking about his son watching Pinocchio, and he kept watching the part when the Pinocchio and Geppetto are escaping from the whale, and he was saying like his son was trying to understand something, and it wasn't something that, his son was like 4 or 5 at the time, but like his unconscious was really trying to make sense of what he was seeing and sort of how that fit in the world. And after hearing that, I've sort of looked back at the things that really captured my imagination for, anywhere from like 6 months to a year, and just, no, I haven't been able to figure out what it was like teaching me, but I do find it interesting trying to figure that out. Like, okay, what was going through my mind at the time that I needed to like, binge this story in particular, or this song in particular, so that I could like get through it and then move on to something new.
Yeah, no, I've never actually, surprisingly, I've never really heard that lecture by Dr. Peterson, but that's so true. And, when you just get on this kick of something, and whether it's a story or a song or something, and it's just this deep connection you have to it, and you're trying to make sense of what's going on. And that's currently me with the Kalevala, of course. But, I don't know why I'm so drawn to it. I've always loved the country of Finland, just learning about their history, and that started from my interest in World War II when I was younger, and sort of the Winter War, what the Finns were up to against the Russians and stuff, and just learning about the great leaders in the Finnish army, Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, which is as a young man growing up who was like the military history nerd, he was one of my sort of like idols, But anyways, yeah, no, it's really interesting getting on these kicks that people so often do, and there's really great significance to that, I think.
As an aside here, since you bring up Mannerheim, have you ever heard the candid conversation recorded between Marshal Mannerheim and Adolf Hitler? It's the weirdest thing. It'll give you chills. It was actually it's the only time that Hitler was recorded without his permission.
Wow.
Yeah. So someone from what's still currently like the public broadcaster in Finland, Yle, YLE, they went in there and they left a microphone in like the train coach that the two of them were going to be in there, plus a bunch of other Nazis and stuff, but they didn't talk. It was just mostly Hitler talking, because he likes to talk, I think. Mm-hmm. But it was actually the only time, like, he used a completely different register of his voice. He wasn't like this whole big the propaganda thing. And that recording in particular was the inspiration for one of my favorite films is Der Untergang, Downfall. I have to remember the English translation of the title. German film about the final days of World War II in Berlin, and it was the only time where a German actually ever portrayed Hitler in a serious role. And it was super controversial because he portrayed him kind of in a human way, and he mirrored his speech pattern and all that based on essentially that one recording. Like he studied it. I have to remember the actor's name, but fantastic actor. And that movie is one of my favorites of all time. It's actually the source of those Hitler memes on the internet where he goes on a rant and things. That's from that movie, and it's a much better movie than those memes would give you. But that's just a little thing about Mannerheim. I don't know if you'd looked at that, but that's, I think, one of the cooler little bits of history that I think is associated with him.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that there was a recording, but I have yet to listen to it, because you can listen to it, right? It's out. Yeah.
I forget where I saw it. It might have even been on like the Wikipedia page for this incident or something like that. You might be able to listen to it there. But
yeah, I'll be sure to check that out. And I have a book about Mannerheim. I should get that out again. But really, a lot of people gain inspiration from Rommel or Patton, more of the well-known World War II generals. But Mannerheim, he was something else, especially because just the how this and this is totally going down a rabbit hole, but if you just study the country of Finland historically, and I'm just geeking out now, but when I was reading about the Kalevala, it's like, it was Tacitus who described them as being impoverished and sort of very underdeveloped when he was talking about the Sami people. Just these kind of people who would talking about the bear cults that existed and how they'd honor the spirits of the bear, and people who just kind of ate reindeer all day and slept on the ground and ate primitive food. But yet this country is a country of such strength, and during the Winter War, how they were vastly outnumbered. They didn't have any money, barely had any supplies, but were able to inflict such damage upon the Russian army. And a lot of people don't know that the Russian army invading Finland at the time was actually larger than the Allied invasion of D-Day in Normandy. So just remarkable stuff.
Well, I did not know that.
The scale was huge, and I mean they really just won through guerrilla warfare, and it was probably not the first usage of it at the time, but they just mastered it for the time period, and really it was the will of the people at that time, and Mannerheim's ability to bring that up. The word for that in Finnish is sisu, and that really just the word in itself embodies the Finnish spirit in general. There's not even really a direct translation for it, because that's really specifically, it's like the national spirit of Finland is sisu, and I don't know, they just embody that all there. But and then you mentioned the Sami though, and the interesting thing is that the Sami separated from what nowadays we would consider the Finnish people significantly earlier than you would even expect, something like at least 3,000 years by some estimates, where they essentially just turned into the native people of the far, far north, really similar to our Inuit. And actually, there's some linguistic theories about how the Inuit languages and the languages of the far, far north in general might all have some distant relation to one another. There's a few little linguistic characteristics that are present in Sami and also present in like Inuit and a few other things, which is just really cool to me. But they separated from them for like such a long time ago, and even today the Sami have such a distinct culture from the mainstream Finns, and they keep it separate, and they consider them the same as Native Americans or Aboriginal Canadians, Indigenous Canadians here, and it's really quite something to see kind of that culture. But that is how they lived, though, is reindeer herding. It was a hunter culture as opposed to an agriculturalist culture. Really, that's the main difference, I would say. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, have you seen the movie, since you brought up movies, have you seen the movie Talvisota?
Talvisota. Well, no, I don't believe I've seen that one. Is it a recent one?
No. It was made in the 80s, and it's actually about the Winter War, and it's in Finnish, and it won all sorts of awards in Finland, but yeah.
No, that's I know that's one I should see. There's another really, really famous war film from the 50s, Tuntematon sotilas, the unknown soldier, and that is considered a classic by like a lot of film buffs and stuff, and it was made in the 50s. There was a remake in the 80s. Another cool one to take a look at. It was a book series originally by a soldier who fought there, and he was really, really well regarded for his portrayal of the war kind of in a more realistic manner. It wasn't rah patriotic. It was like realistic, and the characters were like well developed. They came from all over the country as well, so they all had kind of different accents and stuff. And it was like a really important book. It's one I've been trying to read for a while, but it's hard. I'm not that good at Finnish yet, apparently. But no. Talvisota. Yeah, I know of that film, but I haven't seen it. But Tuntematon Sodilas, The Unknown Soldier, is another one I would recommend.
Yeah. Interesting. I'll be sure to check that out.
And likewise with Talvisota. Yeah. So
I'm trying to think if Jocko Willink has covered anything in the like in the Winter War or any Finnish Russian stuff. I don't think he has.
No,
he should though.
He should. He would really dig that stuff.
Definitely.
I think we've mentioned like in other conversations about the Jocko podcast, and that we think you would really enjoy it. So
yeah.
And just like a little bit of background, he's like an ex-Navy SEAL, and he's got a book, like essentially a business book called Extreme Ownership, which goes into kind of like the business principles that he learned as the leadership. Yeah, I mixed up my words. The leadership principles he learned as a Navy SEAL applied to business, and then really by extension sort of applied to daily life in general. And his podcast is awesome. Get after it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And yeah, I definitely think you'd love it because he looks at different books. Usually the books are written by soldiers who participated in the particular war that he's talking about.
Oh, wow.
And he gleans like leadership lessons from the books, but it's also because he's actually fought in war, he's able to really bring it to life and make it real in a way that just reading it on your own as a non-serving person, as a civilian, it just really brings it to life. So I highly recommend it. I literally can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds lovely. I'll be sure to tune into that this evening, check it out. But wow. Yeah, I apologize for getting us down that rabbit hole, but the Kalevala was brought up, and instantly my mind goes to my beloved Finland. So
absolutely, no, we're all about rabbit holes here.
Yeah, I'm sure you're aware. We kind of go into that a lot, and whenever we say we're going down the rabbit hole, it's like, oh yeah, we're getting going.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Another good one. A few slightly obscure things, but I'm just as equally excited about all that same stuff. So that's awesome. I think we'd like to know just a little bit about what you have coming up. Like, what are your plans for the History of Vikings? Anything else you're doing? Like, what's in store for your future?
Yeah. A lot of exciting things coming for the History of Vikings. It's just remarkable to see the amount of growth that we've seen. The show, we meaning myself, in 3 months. And just, it's continuing to grow. A lot of people are continuing to latch onto it. A lot of great interviews coming up. Caroline Larrington, Roderick Dale of the University of Nottingham is going to be talking about Viking berserkers. It's actually what he wrote his dissertation on, and as well as Daniele Bolelli, as mentioned earlier. A lot of great interviews. A lot of, in talks with a lot of other great people who I'm trying to get on the show. And I've been interviewed on some other great podcasts that people should check out. And, I'm going to keep doing stuff, and I'm going to keep digging into the myths. And I'm kind of kicking myself now that I'm discovering other mythologies in naming my show The History of Vikings. But but we'll definitely start to, or continue to include Norse mythology and dive even deeper into the history of Vikings. I want to talk about Ibn Fadlan and sort of the Islamic view, because Ibn Fadlan was actually an Arabic diplomat who traveled to Viking Scandinavia, and I want to do an episode about that, and just continuing to grow and continuing to get excited about these timeless myths and stories and histories.
That's awesome. That sounds like it certainly sounds like you've got your plate full. Yeah. There's going to be lots for you to cover, and you'll never have that problem of not knowing what to talk about next. There's always going to be something. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. There's certainly that element to it. There's just so much to include, And that's the one thing with my show is I was like, what I love about your guys' show is, you really have a structure. You're going through the Kalevala and going through the Havamal and stuff. Whereas my show is more of just kind of like a buffet of all sorts of different topics. But I suppose that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're absolutely in love with Norse history.
Well, that's right. You need a little bit of both. You need a little bit of whatever. I mean, your approach. If people listen to your show, they'll get just so many different views of history, so many different fantastic experts and just other enthusiasts. Because I mean, I certainly wouldn't call us experts. Just got to remind people of that in general.
Yeah, when I was talking earlier about you talking to actual bona fide experts, I was kind of referring to us as not the experts. We are definitely not experts. Yeah.
No, but you've had like such good conversations, and I mean, listening to your show, I mean, that's what's great about it is that you enable your listeners to hear all these different perspectives from all these people who know just so much stuff, right? And I mean, for us, it's a little different. I mean, like our concept is very kind of fixed, right? Like we know what we're doing as far as like our explorations of these stories and whatnot, but getting guests onto the show as well to talk about this stuff and talk about these things from the same sorts of perspectives. I mean, that's why I asked about, how this is affecting your life, like how you bring that in, because that's always something that we want to do as well, as we're looking at these stories for that purpose. And I mean, again, it's different things. If people are interested in your show for all the breadth of things that they get to hear, I mean, then we just drill down like so far, right? I mean, yeah. So listen to both. I think that's the idea, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome. Hey, I think we're kind of wrapping up here. It's been a great discussion, great conversation, and obviously we can talk about tons more, right? Yeah. We could go on for a really long time. So we'll definitely have to have you back on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking right now we could have a whole episode just on movies that we watch.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No, we could talk for hours and hours, whether it be about Norse myth or the Kalevala or movies or podcasts. There's just endless things to talk about.
Definitely. So we'll certainly have to do this again. How can our listeners find you and reach you and get in contact?
Yeah, well, you can find my podcast, obviously, The History of Vikings, wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch with me, I'll just give you my email. It's noah@thehistoryofvikings.com. Or follow me on Twitter, which is just @historyofviking. Really exciting conversations and discussions occur on Twitter.
Absolutely. No. Highly encourage you to give Noah a follow here and check out his show, History of Vikings. Highly recommend it. So
definitely, it just dovetails so nicely with our show that you'll be able to get a much broader picture of what we're talking about and sort of put everything into context. Yeah, so highly recommend it.
And that's why I think it's been so awesome that we've found each other and gotten to know one another. And I mean, I'll give you credit, Noah, that you found us and reached out to us first. And I mean, I'm so glad that you did, because it's been great getting to know you, great talking to you, and hopefully this discussion and these interviews, hopefully this is the start of something great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an honor to know you both, and I hope this is indeed the beginning of possibly months and years of our shows becoming friends and having great discussions.
I would like that for sure.
Agreed. Great. Well, I think we're going to call that a night here. It's the evening when we're recording right now. So thank you again, Noah, for coming on the show. It's been great talking to you, and I think now we're just going to our usual acknowledgements. We didn't read anything from his translation of the Poetic Edda, but we do usually, and since we talked about him a little bit, Dr. Jackson Crawford, his version of the Poetic Edda and his YouTube channel, highly recommend you check those out, and that's how you can follow along with us. Also would recommend Dr. Carolyn Larrington's translation of the Poetic Edda if you want a different perspective on things. She's fantastic. Obviously has been on Noah's show, will have been on his show twice now, and so highly recommend both of those. And of course, it would be wrong of us if we didn't acknowledge the heavy influence of Dr. Jordan Peterson on our show. Definitely wouldn't be doing this show in this format at all without his influence, especially his biblical series of lectures and his university lectures, Maps of Meaning, being probably his most influential. And with that, you can find us on Twitter as well, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're at Northern Myths Podcast on Instagram, Northern Myths Alone on Facebook, and at Northern Myths on Twitter. We're both personally on Twitter as well, North Myth Luke and North Myths Dan. So come check us out. Also, if you're just listening to the show through the podcast, we've also got our YouTube channel. We're building in a few new things with that and getting into more clips and smaller things as well. Noah's got a YouTube channel, like you mentioned as well, just to shout out to that. You can find his channel as well if you go to ours. He's one of our featured channels. I think that's about it. Just highly encourage you to subscribe and share. We always appreciate that, and connect with us. We love hearing from you. We love hearing any responses, any feedback. It's always so encouraging to just get some nice feedback. A tweet or a comment or a review. Those are always really appreciated. So please do that if you have the time. Am I missing anything?
No, I think the only thing left for us to do and for you, the listener, to do is go find the myth you're living.
Sounds good. And with that, this has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thank you again to Noah Tetzner of the History of Vikings. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.